Hello, welcome back to Women's History. All right, today we're going to pick up on the outline with the beginning of colonial America, which is the first chapter of our ebook. So, let's talk about the colonization of America. Just a little background information. The first English colony was set up in Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. That first colony was actually settled by single young Englishmen who were looking for gold, glory, and excitement. A lot of Europeans thought that there was gold all over North America and South America because the Spaniards had found a lot of gold in South America, gold and silver. So there was a misunderstanding by a lot of Europeans that when they came to North America, they were going to find a lot of gold. And so that was one of the motivations for the English coming to North America. All right. Eventually, though, Jamestown survived its early years and became the first successful English colony in the Americas. And women eventually started to arrive in the Virginia settlement. So it wasn't inhabited by single men for very long. All right, so let's talk about why would women come to the American colonies. Well, women came for a lot of the same reasons that the men came. They were looking for new opportunities. They were looking for maybe adventure. They were looking for a better life than they had in England. So that's why women would come, same reason that men were motivated to come to a new land. So, in Virginia, we have families coming, and their main source of income was farming, and tobacco was a big crop that was farmed in English Virginia. In the 1630s, there were settlements in the northern part of North America in Massachusetts, and the first group of colonists that actually come in the 1620s. That's the Pilgrims, and they're looking for religious freedom. They don't like how the Church of England is being run in England, and they want to run the church their way in a new land. And so pilgrims come to Massachusetts in family units, and they founded the Plymouth colony in Massachusetts. And then by the 1630s, we have a new group of English settlers coming in who also are looking for religious freedom, and they're the Puritans. And they also don't like how the church is being run in England, and they want religious freedom also. Massachusetts Bay Colony, which is founded, it is where Boston is today. That was the heart of that settlement. The Pilgrims and Puritans both are English settlers. They both want religious freedoms. They both think they're going to set up the perfect Christian society, and they both come to the Americas in family units. And now, all of the New England colonies around Massachusetts are really settled by Puritans. Puritans end up outnumbering the Pilgrims pretty quickly, and a lot of Puritans moved outside of Massachusetts eventually and set up the neighboring colonies, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and all the New England colonies up there. So that's the New England settlements. The middle colonies, where we live, New Jersey, New York, Delaware, was actually first settled by the Dutch in the early 1600s, but later the British just took it. Of people coming to the middle colonies for mainly economic opportunity. So, early European colonists in North America were diverse. Some came for different reasons, religious or economic prosperity, and so were the women that arrived here. So let's talk about women and work in the colonial period. The main work of many European American women in the colonies was household duties. That included preparing the food, caring for the children, building and keeping the fire. They also did things like brew the cider. They gathered eggs. They milked the cows. They sewed clothing. They cleaned the house. And women really play a very important role in colonial life. There are women who were involved economically in their communities, especially in more city areas. There were women who were involved in trading, who helped their husbands run their shops. and who worked as servants. If a family lived in a farm or in a more rural area, women were preparing food. In the South, there were women who supervised slaves, the family slaves. So that was also could be part of women's work. All right, let me bring up slaves for a minute in the European colonies. I'm going to get into slaves in more detail in a minute, but in the South, slave women from Africa worked in the fields cultivating things like tobacco and rice. That's my puppy playing with his toy in the background, by the way. That's going to be a constant noise this semester, I think. Some slave women worked domestically, cooking, sewing, caring for children in their masters' homes. And again, I'm going to go into slavery and the history of that in more detail, but there are slaves in European colonies. And here's another thing that a lot of people don't know. There were, in the triangle trade, there were slaves brought into every colony, including the northern colonies. There were slaves in every one of the 13 colonies had African slaves. There were more slaves that were brought to the South because that was where the demand was for the labor because of the cash crops. But there were slaves brought up north also, but just not as many. All right, let's talk about childbirth for a minute. Childbirth in the colonial period was a female ritual. Pregnant women would store groaning cakes and beer for the women who were going to help them deliver their babies. A groaning cake, it was a biscuit and it would get stale, but it could keep for a long time. And pregnant women would bake these cakes and they would store them. And then when women would come over, like their neighbors or their family members come over to help them deliver their babies, they would have these cakes that would be dipped in coffee or tea, and then it would be able to soften up and be able to be eaten. And that was how they would be a good hostess as a pregnant woman to feed their guests as they were helping them give birth. So once labor began, midwives, female neighbors, family members who were female would arrive at the pregnant woman's house to help them give birth. There isn't any formal medical assistance for women giving birth back in the colonial period. If you were isolated with your husband and there weren't any neighbors or female midwives, then your husband would have to help you give birth. But for most of the point, it was a female ritual. As you can imagine, childbirth in the colonial period was very difficult. Many women died from complications. Even if you survived the birth, there would be complications. Women hemorrhaged, they had infections. A lot of women and children actually died from infections. They did not have antibiotics to treat infections back in the colonial period. Motherhood often brought sadness to colonial women. And children were very vulnerable to accidents and diseases in their early years. So if a child could live past the first 5 years, they had a good chance of growing to adulthood. But the first 5 years were very, very risky for children. Some people ask me, what about, were all children born in wedlock? No. There were colonial women who were tried for adultery or fornication if they had children out of wedlock. So there were legal consequences if you were found to have a child out of wedlock, but it did happen. But in terms of children out of wedlock, we tend to think of the colonial period as a time when people were very religious and they, followed all the rules, but they're human. And of course, people had affairs, people had sex outside of marriage, and there were children born out of wedlock, but it was it could be considered a crime, and it was frowned upon in colonial society. So that's a little bit about that topic. All right, what about witchcraft and social conflict in Puritan New England? Um, I'm going to talk about two famous cases in colonial America in which social conflict revolved around women. And both of these happened in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And I just want to give you a little background of the Massachusetts Bay Colony before we get into Anne Hutchinson and the Salem witch trials. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was founded by the Puritans. And the Puritans, when they first came, tried to set up a very, very strict religious society. In their early colony, the leaders of the church were also the political leaders. And they tried to impose their religious rules through law. And there were a lot of rules for Puritan society. One of the rules was in the beginning, all houses had to be within a half mile of the church. And that rule came in the late 1630s. And that was so that people could be watched at their homes, so that they wouldn't, do things they weren't supposed to do that would be considered sinful. And the ministers could watch everyone. Obviously, as time went on and more Puritans moved to Massachusetts, that rule was impossible to enforce. But it was a pretty strict society. And the Puritans believed that the way that you go to heaven when you die is by doing good deeds and working hard. And that was the focus of their life, was doing good deeds and working hard and following the rules. And that was why it was such a strict society. And they did fear the wrath of God. They believed that if they allowed sins to happen in their community, God would punish all of them. And so that's why the rules were so strict in Puritan society, because they were trying to keep the wrath of God away. They wanted to please God so that they would not be punished by God. Now, I'm going to be bringing up two cases in which women defied or disagreed with Puritan teaching, or they caused social conflict. So let's start with Anne Hutchinson. I like to talk about Anne Hutchinson because Hutchinson believed she was a Puritan woman. She moved to Boston with her husband and many children. They had many, many children. I forget how many. She had I think she had 16 children by the time she died. And when she first moved to Boston, she worked as a midwife. She was an upstanding member of society, no problems. But as she went to church and she saw how things were in Massachusetts, and she saw how strict the society was, and it was much more strict than it had been living in Puritan society in England. She didn't like what she saw, and she disagreed with some of the Puritan teachings. And one of the things she disagreed with was she believed that you can connect to God through yourself, through inner grace. You don't have to go sit in church in a pew for 3 hours on Sunday to find God. That everybody is born with a connection to God. And so that was one of the things that the Puritans believed, that no, the way you find God is following the rules and being in church and listening to the ministers. And she disagreed with that. So she began to have Bible studies in her house for other women. When other women were coming to her house, and they would talk about the Bible and talk about what the ministers said in church on Sunday, the ministers didn't have a problem with that because it was women. Women didn't have a right to vote. Women were not powerful people in Puritan society. So it was fine when she was just talking to women. But some of the women began to bring their husbands to these meetings. And in these meetings, Anne would criticize the minister's teachings. That is when the Puritan leaders were upset, because she was empowering people by saying that they didn't need the church leaders to find God. And the church leaders didn't like that. She was really challenging Puritan leadership and criticizing their teachings. And as a result, they put her on trial for being a bad wife, a bad parishioner, a bad citizen. They thought she was bad for the community. And they found her guilty. Of course, it was all male trial. And she was excommunicated from the church and kicked out of the colony. And she and her family moved to Rhode Island. And in 1642, she ended up taking 6 of her children. Some of her children were adults by the time this happened. But 6 of her children moved to New York, which at that time was a Dutch colony. And they ended up being killed in a Native American raid. I think one of her children lived and the rest were killed. And again, that was only some of her children. So, but the reason I bring up Anne Hutchinson is her story is important to women's history because her teachings empowered women. She tried to weaken the power of the Puritan ministers who were men. And she's a rare critic in Puritan society. Most women would never dare bring up anything critical about the Puritan leaders because that wasn't a woman's place in colonial America. But she is very rare for standing up for what she believed in and not backing down to her beliefs. So that's a little story of Anne Hutchinson, who kind of broke the rules in Puritan society. All right, the Salem witch trials is another instance in colonial America where social conflict kind of revolved around women. And this begins in Salem, Massachusetts, of 1692. There were several girls who claimed they were ill. and they were clutching their stomachs and they were having convulsions. And when the physician was called, not finding any physical reason for their pains, the physician said that it was bewitchment. And so he started to ask the girls, "Who's bewitching you?" And they named different women, but one of the first women that they named was Tituba. Tituba was a West Indies servant who worked for one of the girls' families. And she was outside of mainstream society. And she's a good example of a target of the girls' witchcraft claims. They would not name someone who was an upstanding member of society of being a witch because nobody would believe that. They named people who were different, who were a little bit outside the norm. And Tituba kind of fit that mold. So that's why she was one of the first people accused. Um, Tituba wore loud clothing, like brightly colored clothing that the Puritans didn't wear. She was from the West Indies. There were stories that she was outspoken, which wasn't suitable for women in Puritan society, and so she was an easy target for the girls. But the other people that they accused early on were the elderly, women who were new to the area, and women who were different, like Tituba. There also were men who were accused, so it's not just women that were accused of witchcraft. So this began to spread. More and more of these teenage girls around different towns started to have bewitchment and started to get sick. And so this got the Puritan leaders' attention. And the Puritan leaders started to ask them, "Who's bewitching you?" And these girls started to name more and more people. They named so many people that they had to set up a special court to examine the accused. Hundreds of people were accused in that spring of 1692. And most of them confessed, and that might surprise you. But the way it worked was if you were questioned, and the way they would question the suspected witches was in a public forum. So they would crowd into a room, bring the accused witch, bring the Puritan leaders, and then they would bring the accused girls in. And the girls would fall on the floor and scream and claim they were being hurt and put on a good show. And a lot of the leaders believed the girls because the women were saying, "I'm not a witch," but the girls were saying they were being bewitched, and it was very convincing. So the way it worked was, if you were accused of being a witch, you had a choice. You could either confess, and if you confess, they allow you to repent and go back to your life, or if you say you're not guilty, you claim you're innocent, you have to go to trial, and that is certain. You're going to be certainly convicted, and the punishment for witchcraft is death. Every single person that was brought to trial was found guilty. And in the end, 20 men and women were brought to trial. All 20 were found guilty, and they were all executed by hanging, except one man was crushed to death because he wouldn't say if he was guilty or not guilty. So they laid him down and they put rocks on his chest. Every rock they put on his chest, they said, "Are you guilty or not guilty?" He wouldn't answer until he couldn't breathe, and then he died. So this witchcraft hysteria really lasted almost the whole year of 1692. But it ends at the end of the year when the women begin to accuse people from all levels of Puritan society, not just the people on the fringe. They start to accuse, ministers' wives. They start to accuse the governor. They accuse, all these prominent people, politically and religiously. And then the Puritan leaders realized they made a mistake. Unfortunately, 20 men and women were dead by the end of that ordeal. And that is a very, very unique time period. Now let's talk for a minute about women in witchcraft in Europe. That is not unique to Puritan America or Puritan England. Europeans in many countries believed in witchcraft for centuries, and often women were viewed as witches. And that's because there is a connection in old Europe between the devil and witchcraft. Europeans believed that witchcraft was connected to devil worshipping. And since Europeans viewed women as the weaker sex than men, they felt that women would be more likely to be manipulated by the devil than men. Therefore, there are more women who are witches than men. Most accused witches in European history are women that are usually on the fringe of society: senior citizen women, women who were different. So what happened in Puritan society isn't unique to Europeans. This had happened other times in history, and oftentimes women are accused of being witches. What happened though in Salem in 1692 was it was a hysteria. The level of accusations was to such a level that it involved hundreds and hundreds of people, and that is what made it very unique. Um, and a lot of people wonder what caused it. And to this day, we don't have an answer to that. There are theories about the Salem witch trials. The one theory that I think is the most interesting is looking at the girls themselves. I don't think these girls who claim they were being bewitched are evil. I think they got caught up in something that got bigger than them. That's just my personal opinion. I think it may have started innocently. There might have been a few girls who really got sick, and the doctor couldn't find a physical reason, so he said, "Oh, they're bewitched." Before they know it, the ministers are coming to their house, asking and giving them attention and asking them, who's bewitching you? And many of them may have liked that attention. And they might have accused people because they liked the fact that the ministers were giving them so much respect and attention, something they had never had before. If you think about Puritan society in America in this time period, who are the people who have the least amount of power and the least amount of attention given to them? Young girls. Because the boys are being primed to become the new leaders, the new ministers. So raising boys is the boys are given a lot more attention because they are either focused on their education, they're focused on learning a trade, so that one day they can support their families. There's a lot more attention given to boys than girls. The girls are mainly home with their mothers. They are taught household duties, but they are not paid any attention by the leadership um, of society, the ministers, the political leaders. So I think that in that type of society where girls were the least valuable, that this was enticing to them. The idea that they could say that they were being bewitched, and all of a sudden they were a star. They were the key uh, prosecuting witness in these trials, and they were important. And I think other girls might have seen that, and then they said they were being bewitched because they wanted attention also. And they might have done it innocently. They might have thought it was fun. They might have thought, like, the attention. They might not have realized it was going to lead to people being killed. And then once it was all over and there were 20 people dead, they probably were afraid to admit that they had lied. And so they just kept quiet. And students always ask me, what happened to the accusers? What happened to those girls? Nothing happened to those girls. Were they punished? No. They weren't. They went about their lives. Some of them probably felt guilty for making up stories about, people being bewitched, but there wasn't any punishment. What did happen, though, is after the trials are ended at the end of 1692, they shut down the court, they stopped, all the accusations stopped, they kind of came to their senses. Then people started to retract their confessions and say, "Hey, I lied. I'm not a witch. I'm not going to say I'm a witch just to please the court." And eventually, the government in Massachusetts apologized to the families of the victims and the people who were accused, and even paid the families money, families who had lost loved ones. So there was restitution for the families. So that is a very unique time in early American history where women were really the center of social conflict. Both Anne Hutchinson and the Salem witch trials are two instances where women who have very little power are the center of social conflict. All right, so that's where I'm going to leave this video. We'll pick up with slave women in the English colonies in the next video. See you then.